Listen, let's get one thing out of the way first. I love the Nintendo Switch. After the failure of the Wii U, this is exactly what Nintendo needed at the time. It appealed to a broad audience, it was clear what the gimmick was, and it had some of the most revolutionary Nintendo games on the system. Anyone who is anyone knew what a Switch was, and thought it was pretty cool. However, that being said, the Switch is not immune to criticism and problems too. There are a few minor ones, but there is one big issue that I have with this console that honestly gets worse every year and becomes more and more apparent. And just to get it out of the way, no, it isn't the Joy-Con drift. Even though this is definitely a problem, at least there are fixes to it. You can clean under the joystick or place a piece of cardboard under the stick as well. Or heck, another solution is just to buy a new Joy-Con controller. Listen, I'm not saying these are good solutions for this issue, but they are still solutions nonetheless. Whereas the big problem that I have has no foreseeable way to fix this in sight. But before we delve into this, I think it's important to understand where this problem came from. Because really, when you think about it, this didn't just start in the Switch era, but the seed of this problem was planted in Nintendo's previous consoles. Here's what I mean. Okay, so when the Wii came out, this was the first time Nintendo really didn't upgrade the graphics for a new system. And you know what? This was a great decision at the time. They focused on the innovations in gaming and not just the graphics, which put them apart from their competitors. Plus, HD games were not even the standard at the time, so keeping the lower resolution and performance was completely fine. So I think Nintendo saw that it wasn't the power that sells a console, but rather the new ways to interact with games that it provides. So they kept this up with their next console, being the Wii U. They had a new second screen concept when playing video games. This time they did upgrade the graphics, however, but they really had to at this point. It was 2012 now, HD TVs were quickly the standard, and 4K TVs were starting to release around this time too. Launching a brand new console with anything less would simply be unacceptable. But they were still playing catch up too, since they were just matching the hardware that came out in 2005-2006 for the other consoles. But after that came the Switch, of course, and again, it strived for innovative features such as the home console portable hybrid, which was awesome. The graphics, however, were very similar to the Wii U. So now Nintendo is like 2 generations behind in terms of hardware, graphics, and performance. And this is because 2 jumps in the hardware for home consoles have been made since the launch of the Wii U. And Nintendo really hasn't done anything to improve the power of their systems in that time. And I was even fine with this at the console's release. It created such a brand new concept that I wasn't focused on the hardware of the console at all. But now, 5 years later, with a lot of different competition, Nintendo's hardware is really outdated. And that, right now, in 2022, is my biggest problem with the Switch. Nintendo has neglected graphics, power, and performance, so much so that it is now affecting the gameplay of the console. Affecting the gameplay? How does that make sense, I hear you say? Wouldn't upgrading the hardware just make these games look better? Well, I think there is a lot more to this problem under the surface. So much so that it is now hurting the quality of games that are produced for the Switch and the actual gameplay in those games. It's kind of like a ripple effect that hinders many aspects of the Switch that you might have not even considered. And if you still think not upgrading the hardware of a Switch isn't a big deal, then that is fine, but you gotta listen to a few points that I have that can better showcase how this brings down the whole gameplay experience and how it even limits what developers can do. Plus, I want to talk about one thing I hear that is commonly used to defend this hardware later in the video. And I'll give you my thoughts on the Switch OLED, because this thing is quite odd. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the first point I have here. And I'm gonna start with the more obvious ones, and then we can get on to the more serious issues later in the video. But for now, this first point I have here is the frame rates. Yeah, they're not great. The standard for games is now becoming 60 frames per second, and the Switch, in many cases, can't retain a constant 30 frames. If it was just some third-party games that had some frame drops, then I could honestly understand this to a degree, but the fact is, majority of big Nintendo game releases have noticeable frame drops while playing. Breath of the Wild, Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, Pokemon Sword and Shield, Metroid Dread, Link's Awakening, just to name you some off the top of my head. These were apparent at the very launch of the Switch too. Like, how is it that they release brand new hardware with noticeable frame drops? And Nintendo knows how to make games run for their hardware, so if these guys, you know, the ones that actually make the hardware themselves, can't optimize the games to have a constant frame rate, then how on earth are third-party developers supposed to do it? Anyways, now we gotta move on to my next point here, and this is one I'm not gonna really spend too much time on, but it's the load times. Okay, so a little story time about this one. I finally managed to get a PS5, and this console virtually has no load times. I can start a game, and in literally 15 seconds, I'm into the gameplay. Loading screens are non-existent with this thing, so it actually becomes super jarring now when I switch to playing, well, you know, the Switch. It's totally understandable when I go back and play retro games, but the Switch is Nintendo's most modern console. It even got a new updated model in the Switch OLED, which released a year after the launch of the PS5 and Xbox Series X, mind you, so it should have the fastest load times out of all of them, but instead it has the slowest. But again, this also even affects the user's experience within a game more than you think. Like fast traveling, for example, takes much longer than it should, which just de-incentivizes the player from using that feature. Like, I don't think I need to explain to you why loading screens suck, they just take you out of the whole experience. But now let's start to get into more of how this really affects the games that are being produced on the Switch, because my next point here is how the Switch limits what developers can do. Games on Switch that have a more realistic style don't look all that great by 2022 standards. So it kinda incentivizes developers to make more cartoony or stylized games for the Switch. And it makes games that are going for realism look heavily inferior to other console versions, like sports games for example. Also, games are getting bigger than ever now. There are so many things that game devs just pack into these. And Nintendo is trying to do that too with many of their IPs. But I can't help but think the hardware is limiting them in some way. Like, okay, tinfoil hat theory time, but you ever think part of the reason that Breath of the Wild 2 keeps getting delayed is because they're having trouble optimizing the game on this hardware? This game looks to be huge with an even bigger open world, but are there still gonna be those same frame rate issues as in the original game? And then another series that is trying to go bigger than ever now is Pokemon, with Legends Arceus and the recently announced Pokemon Violet and Scarlet. And even with just the first trailer, it already looks like it has frame rate issues. Like, how long is this gonna go on for? How much more can they really get away with on this hardware? Okay, maybe I cherry-picked an example here because a lot of Game Freak games have pretty ugly graphics, but notice how this only started on the Switch too? This wasn't an issue when working on the 3DS Pokemon games, but as soon as they try to be ambitious with the wild area, for example, the performance takes a hit. Another limitation that also relates to this, but I kind of wanted to keep this as a separate point still, and that is how the Switch limits the amount of, you know, just stuff you can have on screen at any point. If there's a lot of moving objects or particle effects, the frame rate can move to a crawling speed sometimes. One of the most infamous examples is Age of Calamity, since it's based on fighting these large groups of enemies. But when you use certain attacks on these large groups, the gameplay experience is hindered since the frame rate can come to a crawl. Not only that, but this also affects the draw distance. Especially in open world games, the landscape in the far distance many times feels pretty barren because you can't load all these objects at once. Again, this isn't a problem in a handheld mode, but in 2022, with TVs and just other displays getting bigger and bigger now, this is more noticeable than ever, which can take you out of the immersion sometimes. But really, one of the big factors that's hurting the Switch is something that gets worse every single year, and this is how the Switch hardware is affecting third-party releases. Again, at its launch, it was great. It had a bunch of third-party support, so many games were coming to Switch. Plus, the novelty of the Switch was fresh, so for the first time, you could play classics like Skyrim on the go. But now, with the new generation of consoles like the Series X and PS5, it can kinda be a toss-up if the game even gets ported to Switch. Some games do, while others don't. Plus, if the game is made for the current hardware, it is a lot more work to make it run on the Switch, so you'll either get a game that's heavily downgraded graphically and performance-wise, or the devs just won't bother at all to develop it on Switch. And as for the novelty of playing these third-party games on the go, well, now the Switch is starting to have some more powerful competition like the Steam Deck that can play those same games with better performance. And if you are fortunate enough to own two consoles, it still creates another issue, which I call the should I buy the game on Switch or another console dilemma. Yeah, I'm still working on the title. But what I mean by this is that every multi-platform third-party Switch game is not gonna have the definitive version on Switch, because there is always some sort of graphical and performance downgrade on this console. So if you are someone with both a Switch and even a console from last gen, not even current gen, then you'll always have this dilemma. Should I buy the lesser version of this game that I can play in handheld, or should I get the better version and only play it at home? I think it would help the Switch immensely to always have the definitive version on this console. That would just be sweet. I know there's one argument here that defends this, and I want to go over this too, and that is they want to keep the price of the Switch cheap, so in order to achieve this, they have to cut back in the hardware. And I kind of agree with this, but at the same time, I disagree too. It's true, the Switch is below the other current gen console prices, since the Switch is $300 American dollars, while the PS5 and Series X are both $500, but at the same time, they both have cheaper versions in the PS5 digital or the Xbox Series S that go for $400 and $300 respectively. They both don't have disc trays, which suck. Okay, I'll give the Switch that. At least you can physically insert cartridges in all Switches, but the specs for these other consoles still blow the Switch away. Even the Xbox Series S, that is the same price as a Switch, has the storage space of 512 gigs, while the Switch only has 32 gigs, just to give you one comparison of these specs. Sure, the price of the Switch has other factors to it, like the price of a screen, but I still think you get the comparison I'm going for. So I'd say having at least a separate model with increased load times, draw distance, and better graphical fidelity, that would be maybe like 100 or 200 more than the base Switch, would be perfect. I mean, guys, you've made 3 separate models of the Switch already, and none of them update the hardware at all. Honestly, I think the Switch OLED was one of the most odd decisions for a new console. Why would you upgrade the screen to the premium, top-of-the-line viewing experience possible now using OLED pixels whilst still not upgrading the hardware in the slightest? You're still gonna deal with all the frame drops, all of the load times of the original Switch, but in handheld, those frames will look prettier. It's just weird to go all in one area to make the image look better, while not even changing it at all in another area. But okay, these things all on their own might be alright, and honestly were certainly alright at the time the Switch launched, but you have to look at this problem in the current time and compare it to what else is on the market. The Switch has been out for 5 years at this point. TVs, screens, everything is getting bigger and bigger. And the bigger your display is, the more you'll notice little things like the draw distance and things popping in, for example. I get it, graphics aren't everything, and they're not. And I'd honestly be fine if they were still slightly behind the Xbox and PlayStation graphics, but what is offered here is so incredibly behind. And if you want to look at the Wii, how it was also behind in hardware, yes, that is true, but it was only behind by one generation. The Switch, as of now, in 2022, has hardware that is comparable to the Xbox 360, which released all the way back in 2005. Yes, that long ago. A console 17 years old has comparable specs to Nintendo's newest console. And that is why, in a nutshell, I think that this is the biggest problem and why it's hurting the Switch. But let me know if you agree in the comments, and subscribe if you like these in-depth, more analytical videos, because I plan on doing plenty more of them. I will see you guys next time.